How do I become a top front-end developer? Now, if you follow this specific roadmap, then it will help you get a job as a front-end developer, or it will help you figure out the tools that you need to know to become a top tier front-end developer. Now, if you don't have any university degree, aren't good at math, or you don't have prior coding experience, don't worry, because you can still become a front-end developer in this specific year. If I were to start again, this is exactly the roadmap that I would use, and kind of wish I had this when I started to become a front-end developer. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, this is a roadmap that I'll be walking you throughout this video. Now, check the link in the description below for this specific roadmap. Now, this specific roadmap is quite comprehensive. So I do want to add a disclaimer that you don't need to follow each and everything in this specific roadmap. Anything that has a rocket emoji next to it are my recommendations based on my experience. So please use this roadmap as a reference as you try to become a front-end developer, or if you are an existing front-end developer, then you will be exposed to a lot of different tools that exist in the industry today. My plan is to always keep this front-end developer roadmap up to date. So whenever you revisit this specific roadmap, it is always going to have the latest and greatest in the front-end world. As you know, the front-end landscape changes quite a bit. So why exactly should you listen to me? Well, throughout this video, I'm going to be recommending a few things for what you should and shouldn't do in order for you to get a job as a front-end developer, and also for you to level up as a front-end developer as well. So let me introduce myself really quickly. My name is Ankita. I'm a creator educator currently, and my goal is to help you level up in your career and make you a stronger front-end developer. In the past, I have worked in the industry for over a decade. I have worked and grown all the way to a solution architect and scaled and architected many applications, and I specialize in front-end development. And I also write a weekly newsletter called as Front-End Snacks. Now, my job is to stay relevant with the market, to know what's up and coming and share that with you. So this specific newsletter will give you a breakdown of the latest and greatest news in the front-end development world. Also share a front-end developer toolbox with you so you can learn and grow as a front-end developer just like I did. Now, before we dive into the roadmap, let's truly try to understand who we want to become. That is a front-end developer. A front-end developer is a developer that mainly focuses on the front end of the application. Now, a website generally has two parts. One is the front end and the other one is the back end. Now, someone who mainly focuses on how the website looks like, someone like, for example, how the text will be displayed, how there is interactivity on the page, and so on. Overall, the UI, that is the user interface of the website, that is a front-end developer. Versus a back-end developer would be someone who focuses what happens in the background. A backend is a place where we store all our data, and a backend developer would be someone who would look at that data and see what we can do to that data and get all the information necessary so that we can show it on the front end. But if you think about it, speaking of data, the world is an amazing place. At the end of the day, what exactly is internet? Internet or the web is basically a way for us to transfer data between computers. For example, you can see in this diagram, the computers are located all across the world. For example, I'm in Toronto, you could be somewhere else, but still we are communicating with each other through YouTube, through this specific video. And I have uploaded my specific video to YouTube's computer, and YouTube is showing you that from your computer, which isn't that amazing? And that is the power of internet. So if you think about it, the entire web, the internet, is all of us transferring data and sharing data with each other. At the end of the day, this is how websites work. You have a browser that is your computer's browser, which is going to be Google Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and so on. And then from your browser, you're saying that, hey, I want to view this specific video. So you go to youtube.com. And then when you go on youtube.com and you ask YouTube's server is basically YouTube's computer. Now, YouTube is going to be like, okay, sure, I'm going to give you that specific video. Let me go to Ankita's channel and give you the video. Now, it's going to return three things to us, which is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, these are three different files that it will return us. And you don't need to worry about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for now. We will dive into it very soon. Then, in return, it's like, hey, here you go. This is your data. This is essentially how the websites work. But there is a lot more that goes in the background to make those websites work, to make sure internet works, and so on. So let's take a look at some of the fundamentals. Now, if you already know this, you can skip this specific section. But if you don't, then follow along. Now, in the fundamentals part of the section, we have two parts, basics and advanced fundamentals. Now, I highly recommend knowing the basics as well as the advanced fundamentals because this is going to be really important for you to learn. So, the first thing we'll focus on is domain name system, that is DNS. Now, what exactly is DNS? DNS is like a phone directory of all the addresses of the server. It knows exactly where all the computers live. So, for example, in this diagram, if I ask for kulkarniankita.com, I'm asking the domain name system, hey, look in your phone book and tell me where exactly is kulkarniankita.com located. And kulkarniankita.com is my website. And then DNS is going to be like, sure, here you go. And this is the IP address that it's going to send. And this is how the address of a computer essentially looks like. At the bottom is a phone directory. So if I ask for google.com, this is the address of google.com. If I ask for kulkarniankita.com, then this is the address of kulkarniankita.com. At the same time, watch this. If we head over to my terminal, and let's say I say ping google.com, watch what happens. We are basically pinging google.com. And if I copy this specific line and paste it here, look at that, been redirected to google.com. That is because ping is letting us know exactly where the address of google.com is, which is pretty awesome. So that's what DNS does. It's essentially a phone directory with all the addresses of the server. So now let's focus on browsers. Browsers are essentially Chrome, Firefox, Safari, depending on the operating system that you're using, and also Internet Explorer that no one wants to use. But for example, if we go to this specific website, google.com, then this is essentially getting displayed on the browser. Now, if we go back to our diagram for how websites work, this is a browser. And a browser's job is to display the files that the server, that is a backend, sends you. So for example, if these three files are sent HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, a browser's job is to display them so that the user can see what exactly is going on. Just like you and I are communicating in English, that is the language of our choice, then these three languages, that is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, is how browser understands what to display on the web page. So anytime you want to talk to the browser, make sure you're sharing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now we will dive into each one of these a bit later, but that's how browser communicate. Let's take a look at FTP and SFTP. FTP and SFTP essentially stand for File Transfer Protocol or Secure File Transfer Protocol. Now, let's say my server wants to send some sort of HTML files to your server, then we will be using a protocol called as FTP or SFTP. Now, for example, if my computer is essentially sending some sort of a blog file, for example, it doesn't need to be secure, anyone can see it, and in that case, we could use FTP. But let's say we are sending passwords, for example, it's a banking application, or we are sending card payments or any secured healthcare information, then in that case, we need to use SFTP. Let's take a look how it worked back in the day. Now, back in the day, whenever we wanted to send data between computers, we would use a client called as FileZilla. What we would do is from our computer, we would generate the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files for our website. And then those files will be uploaded to a client called as FileZilla, which also supports FTP and SFTP. And then those files would essentially be downloaded onto that other computer where we want the website to be shown. And that's how we would transfer files, transfer data between servers. But now it's obviously way more advanced, and we will be taking a look at later in the roadmap. But this is the evolution of the web. But earlier, back in the day, we would use something called as FileZilla. Now next, let's take a look at HTTP and HTTPS. Now, if we go back to our diagram on how do websites work, whenever we want to, let's say, request X website's data, for example, kulkarniankita.com's data, what the server does is it's going to send you HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The way we would ask for that data is using a protocol called as HTTP and HTTPS. Now, protocols are essentially rules that we need to follow to as maybe transfer files between servers, between computers, or asking for information. All these rules are in place so we know exactly how web works, and there's a standard for how we all do things. So when I ask for kulkarniankita.com's data, then through HTTP or HTTPS, the server is like, sure, here you go. These are all the files. If we head over to frontendsnacks.dev, you can see that this is in fact on HTTPS. Now you want to use HTTPS whenever possible, but you can also do HTTP and this website will work and direct me to HTTPS. But this is how you can basically ask for front-end snacks data and the browser has displayed HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files here. Option is SSH. Let's say we go to github.com, and github.com is essentially a place where you can host all your code. You can store all your code, and when you give data to github.com, then it's available to everyone else to access as well. So if we go to repositories tab on github.com, and we can, let's say if we go to front end snacks, for example, here we can just click on this code option, and now we have two options to clone. And clone means if you want to copy these files and get it on a computer, download it on a computer, and in that case we could use HTTPS or SSH. Now SSH stands for secure shell or secure socket shell. So using a password protected SSH key, we can basically copy this and then clone the data accordingly. So for example, so we can head over to a terminal and type SSH and then use this command to then basically say, I want to log in to git at github.com, or I want to log in to kulkarnienkita at github.com. And this is how I can log in SSH into my profile onto GitHub. So that is another way of using SSH. It's a secure transfer shell. So you can download the files using SSH or HTTPS and basically log in. Next one is JSON, XML, or gRPC. Now these are just different forms of data. Data forms are essentially ways for how we can, the type of data that our server can accept and how we transfer data between the computers or between servers. So for example, typically the servers will send the data to our browser using these three different formats: JSON, XML, or gRPC. So for example, this is a really good post that talks about how protocol buffers, which is what gRPC uses, is different than XML and JSON. Now JSON is going to be this specific line. This is how JSON looks like. This is how XML looks like, and this is how protobuf, which is what gRPC uses, looks like. This is also what JSON looks like. Now this is a data of all the different products, for example, or all the names of people. We can basically get this data and show it onto our front end eventually. But these are the three different data forms how we receive data from the server. Now, JSON is what typically used. So for example, we will be sticking to JSON majority of the time. Now, this is a sample XML document as well, where we are representing a list of books. But this is not used as much anymore. We are mainly sticking to, in the JavaScript world, we mainly stick to JSON format, which is what is represented here. And gRPC is a fairly new way of doing things. It's introduced by Google, and we are still getting around to using gRPC, but I would stick to JSON for becoming a front-end developer. But you should be aware of the other two so you know how you can potentially receive data. The next one is web hosting. Web hosting is essentially, like the name indicates, we are hosting someone else's stuff. We are storing someone else's stuff. So for example, GitHub is essentially a web hosting provider. It allows you to store our website's code into a server, into the specific GitHub server, so that we can then eventually download all our files, or we can eventually access these specific files from wherever we like, or use the specific code to then send it to other computers and so on. It is not just in our local system. But GitHub is essentially a web hosting provider because it is storing all our code. Now, these were just the basics, and that you need to know how the web works and how the internet works. The next one is an editor. Now, IDE stands for Integrated Developer Environment. It's just a fancy way of saying that this is where you're going to write your files. If you go to Google Docs, for example, then this specific docs is used for taking any meeting notes that you want. But whenever you want to write your code, then you can use something called as Visual Studio Code, or you could use any of these options: Visual Studio Code, Sublime, WebStorm IDE. All of these allow you to write your code in that specific editor. Now, Visual Studio Code is free, it's built by Microsoft, and it's really powerful. It's an open source tool, and open source means that anyone can use it for free, completely free of charge, and it runs everywhere. And this is where you would write your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code. So, for example, this is what Visual Studio Code looks like. And if we again open Frontend Stacks, then you can see this is my CSS file, and you can see all these different JavaScript files and so on. So, this is how you can display all your code inside an editor. All the front-end snacks code that I have written is now hosted on GitHub. So let's say you also have a simple personal blog, then all your blog posts could also be hosted on GitHub. So what you would do is you would write your blog in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, store all of that inside of GitHub by going to repositories and creating a new project, and then essentially uploading all your files over here. And git is a command that you would use to interact with GitHub. But this is also very important to know, and it's an industry standard to use Git and GitHub as part of your developer environment. Now the next one is terminal, shell, iterm, command prompt. Now these are different ways of basically interacting with your computer. Now a computer does a lot of things. You can build your websites on your computer, you can create files, folders, and so on your computer. But let's say you want to interact with your computer, then you can also do that using the terminal. Now, I'm using an app called as iTerm, which also uses terminal, but you could also just go to your Mac and go to terminal to do the same. For example, this is my terminal, and the terminal allows you to write commands, and it really makes you feel like a hacker when you open up your terminal and write anything you like. But let's say I can go ahead and change directory, for example, and I can go to my library directory if I like. And this means that I'm now in the library directory. I can just open my Finder using open command on the terminal. So terminal is mainly used as a front-end developer to essentially interact with a computer. So for example, if you want to download files from GitHub that we already saw for your project, then you can easily use the terminal to do that. You would use a command called as git clone, and git is again a command that is created by GitHub so that we can interact with GitHub easily. So for example, if I go back to my frontend snacks repo, and let's say I do want to clone frontend snacks here, I have two options. I could just copy the URL for SSH, and I can just say git clone and then paste it, and this is going to clone frontend snacks for me. Now, obviously, I have set up this specific command on my computer already. That's why I was able to download it. But you could easily use the terminal to interact with your computer, and it's a lot faster to do so as well. So these are all the fundamentals and basics that we have covered so far. Now let's talk about the advanced fundamentals. Now, space complexity, time complexity, data structures, algorithms, security, performance, all of these are essentially advanced fundamentals. They allow you to maximize your code's performance, and there are specific algorithms that you could use. That means there are specific ways we could write code to make our application faster, to make our website faster. So that, let's say, when user goes to kulkarniankita.com, the website is quite fast to load and the user doesn't have to wait. As you saw, my website was really fast because I have been following these and these advanced fundamentals to make my site perform it. Now, we won't be covering all of these in details, but we will be talking about it a bit later. But these are something you really need to learn and brush up on in order for you to become a front-end developer. These fundamentals are really good to know, and you should be aware of them so that you know how computers work, how websites work, and so on. But I don't want you to spend too much time doing it. Just learn it, know about it, and move on and focus on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that we will be talking about because that's truly what's going to make you a front-end developer. No one is going to ask you what a DNS is in an interview. Even if they do, very few people would. It's good that you are aware of it, but they're not going to ask you any complex questions about it to get you a job as a front-end developer. Now, in order for you to become a front-end developer, you truly need to focus on three things. One is HTML, other one is CSS, and the third one is JavaScript, which is what the majority of this roadmap is going to focus on. So, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are three languages that you need to know to communicate with the website and build websites as a front-end developer. The first thing we're going to focus on is HTML. What is HTML? HTML is hypertext markup language. Actually, a way where you can share text between one computer and the other computer. And the browser understands this as a language. Now, there are a lot of things you can do with HTML. You can build a fully functional website. Now, HTML is the foundation of a front-end developer. Now, for example, I have built this really simple site. You can ignore all of this, but you can see that this is an HTML document because the extension is .html. Now, I'm basically just adding the marquee tag subscribe, which is this, which moves the text from one page, one side to the other side. Now, this in itself basically adds a specific transition animation to the website. So in HTML, you can build a fully functional website. Now, here are some of the tags that we can use in HTML. Now, HTML uses something called as tags. Now, these are something that you need to use correctly in your web page because the browser will understand that better. Now, you need to use specific tags in your HTML file to basically describe what's on the page. For example, if we go to this specific site, you can see all the different tags that we can use. For example, if we head over to the HTML element section here on the left-hand side, you can see all the different tags that we can use to describe our page. For example, if we head over to my website, kulkarniankita.com, this specific element is used to describe the text. This is also text. So now if we head over to inspect element and open up browser developer tools, and if you click on this one, you can see I'm using an h1 which is used for heading, which is an HTML tag. Then if we click on this one, then it's a paragraph tag which I'm using to describe the paragraph that I help developers and engineering leaders level up in their careers. Similarly, when there is a form, which is input text and a button, then I'm using a form tag. These are different ways you can essentially communicate with the web page. HTML is how you do that. Now, it's pretty straightforward. You can also reference the HTML MDN documentation to see all the different HTML elements you can use. So for example, A would be the anchor element. It's used for links, for example, and so on. So there are different elements that you can use. You don't need to memorize all of this, but as you build more and more websites, you will get used to some of the common ones that you can use and pretty much use the majority of your life as a front-end developer. Now, HTML is essentially divided into semantic HTML, forms, SEO, and accessibility. Let's focus on semantic HTML. Semantic HTML means that you need to use the correct tag for the correct thing. For example, over here, since it's a heading, I should not use, since it's a heading, it's an H1, I should not use a link tag, for example, because this is not a link. This is an image. And I could use something called as a div, which is used mainly for dividing the page between sections. So for example, div is essentially a layout in a page. Now, Because this is an image, I should not use a div for an image. So semantics basically means that you need to stick to the structure of what those specific tags are. An image, then use the image tag. If you have a paragraph, use the paragraph tag, and so on. So making sure that you're using the semantic HTML is very important for accessibility reasons that we will talk, and also SEO that we will talk about later. And similarly, if we go to my dog's Instagram over here, Kobe Doodle Doo, then here as well, this is an Instagram page and this is a video. So we need to accordingly use the right HTML tag. This is a text, this is a link, and so on. Then we need to use the correct tags in order for us to communicate with the browser that hey, this is what I'm using. The next one is forms. The complex part in an HTML document or in our website is forms. For example, majority of the websites use forms. We use forms to share data between each other. Now you can build a fully functional website with just HTML. For example, a blog. Now I'm using Next.js as a framework, which we'll talk about later, but I could have just built this entire website, this entire blog with just HTML and CSS because HTML provides you a really good foundation. But going back to forms, for example, this itself is a form. The input text and a sub button is a form. Now, if I go back to my dog's Instagram, then I could just upload a new photo altogether using a form and to an Instagram's computer, that is Instagram server, so that Instagram is able to show it. Now, that is the benefit of using form. Similarly, I can go to Twitter, and then on Twitter as well, I could write whatever tweet I want and tweet it. Now, this itself is also a form. Forms do add a bit more complexity to HTML, but you can create a very simple form and just build a fully functional website with just HTML. This is the advantage of using forms. So you need to know what forms are. Now the other one is SEO. SEO stands for search engine optimization. If you follow semantics, that is semantic HTML, then it is a huge benefit for SEO. If you use the proper semantics, means that on Google, your site will rank higher. Now here's how. If we go to google.com, and here I look for Starbucks because Starbucks is something that I truly love. I go to Starbucks pretty much every day. Now, the reason why Starbucks showed up as the first link on the page is because Starbucks pretty much has really good SEO. They're using proper links when the links are needed, headings when headings are needed, and so on. Now, one of the reasons why Google understands what on the page of Starbucks, if you go to the link and read all of the content, it's because Starbucks uses proper HTML tags, proper semantics, so that Google is able to understand. Now, search engine optimization basically means that how can we optimize our site so that our site ranks higher on Google? So whenever a user is searching for a specific term, such as Starbucks, then Google is able to serve exactly what the user is looking for. And for that, we definitely need to use semantic HTML, but there are quite a few other things we need to do in our website to make sure our site is SEO friendly. So that's what SEO is. The other one is accessibility. Web accessibility means that our websites are usable by all users, regardless of any disabilities and visual impairments and so on. If the user is using voiceover, then the website is able to tell the user out loud exactly what is there on the page. So we need to build a website in such a way that our website is accessible and think about all users in general. And that is what accessibility covers. Again, semantics really help with this part as well. It makes your site accessible. Now, WCAG is an organization that essentially focuses on making sure that our sites are accessible, and they release these guidelines that we need to follow to make sure our websites are accessible. If you're interested, then read up on that. How to make your site accessible is definitely a differentiator for you as a front-end developer, because not all developers know about it, and you knowing about it and showing a passion for it means that your ability to get a job is also quite higher. Plus bonus points, you're making the site accessible for everyone. So that is really important to make the web accessible. Now that wraps up HTML. Now there are quite a few ways you can use to make sure that your site is accessible, but at the same time, you don't need to necessarily memorize all the tags that exist in HTML. As you build a website, you will become more and more familiar. But HTML is a foundation, so make sure you focus on that. The next thing that we will focus on in the roadmap is CSS. Now, if we go back to the diagram that we saw earlier, HTML is what we already know, and we know the basics of that. The other two things are CSS and JavaScript. So let's focus on CSS now. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Now, if you go to any website, for example, this is my course website for engineering leadership. It helps you become an engineering leader. Now, in this website, I am using obviously HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, the way the website looks like, the colors, the different gradients, the text, the underline, all of that, the spacing between elements, fonts, and so on, all of this is CSS, which is Cascading Style Sheets. You would use CSS when you want to make the website more pretty. It adds beauty to your website using spacing, using different font sizes, colors, typography, and so on. So you want to use CSS when you want your website to look good. In order for your website to look good, whether it be this site or some other site, what's really important is that you focus on a few key things that we will be covering in the CSS section. So for example, heading back to our roadmap, CSS has a few parts. One is fundamentals that I highly recommend you to start with and focus on if you want to be a good front-end developer. But then as you learn more about front-end, you already have a job, you can start learning a bit more about preprocessors, how to organize your CSS, frameworks, CSS and JS, and so on. But for now, let's focus on fundamentals. The first fundamental is CSS layouts. Now, we have quite a few layouts inside of CSS. And these are the one with the rockets, even among the fundamentals, the things you should prioritize in your learning. So CSS layouts are layouts that tell you how to position and align your elements on your website. Now, there are quite a few layouts in CSS that we can use, and how you would structure the layout is important. So for example, Flexbox and Grid are the two top most important layouts important in CSS, and you should 100% know them. If you learn Flexbox and Grid, you will already have a good hold of CSS in general. Now, if you want to learn Flexbox, there is a website called as Flexbox Froggy. This website is pretty cool. It asks you to set different elements on the left-hand side, and accordingly, this frog is going to move. The other one to learn CSS Grid is called Grid Garden. Now, again, it's asking you that you can just add this specific item over here and play next and watch what happens. For example, now it has moved. So this is just a fun little way, a game to learn Flexbox and CSS and learn the different properties of CSS. Now, at the same time, let's say we go to developer-to-leader.com, which is my website. We inspect element, and if we click on any of these elements, you can see the CSS on the right-hand side that has been applied onto this specific element. So you can inspect any website, what CSS they're using and how they are structuring their website. Flexbox and Grid are part of modern CSS, so definitely pay attention to those. The positioning, display, and floats. Now, these are different ways to position your items onto the page. Display items onto the page, display different elements onto the page, and so on. Now, floats is quite outdated though, because we don't necessarily need to use floats anymore. They were really great back in the day when Flexbox and Grid did not exist. But now that we have Flexbox and Grid, you don't necessarily need to use floats. So this is kind of deprecated in a way. You can still use floats, but no one uses them. Other one is box model. Box model is how margin and padding works on elements. So for example, again, if we go to developer-to-leader.com and inspect element, now let's say I want to see what padding exists on top of these elements. We could just go to the computed tab on the right hand side, and you can see that this is the margin, padding, and so on. So for example, there is no margin and padding here. But let's say if you pick this item, which does, then you can see margin of 32 and padding of this number has been computed on the right hand side. So it will tell you exactly how much margin or padding is used. This is really good for debugging when you're not sure why this element looks a bit weird or funky. So definitely check that out in general, but basically you use box model for that reason. Now the last one is classes versus IDs for element. Now classes and IDs are important for elements in general. This is a nav bar, a navigation bar. So one, two, all one, two, three, four, whatever items exist in this specific navbar, they all should have the same styling. So what we could do is we could give a class name of nav item to this specific class and apply the same styling to all of these elements. But logo, for example, for developer to leader, it's a unique logo. We don't place the logo multiple times onto the page. In that case, we could give an ID, which is a unique identifier to the logo because only one ID exists. Now, if you want to style them by giving it an ID, uh, if you want to style them, you could basically use an ID here. Semantically, this makes more sense. If you style nav item, then items will get the same style. And that's a differentiation between classes and IDs for elements. Now, again, depending on the library that you use for CSS, which we will talk about, you might not even need to use it. But obviously, it's very important to know the differentiation between the two. Now, let's go to a bit more advanced knowledge about CSS. And the reason I've said it advanced is because even though these concepts on its own can be simpler to understand, but you don't necessarily need to know them right away. But among the advanced knowledge, I would say that CSS variables and responsive design is extremely important for you to know for sure. Animations is something that is also important, but no one in the interview about animations. So this is something that is essentially nice to have. So first is animations. You can animate elements on your site to make them look nicer. For example, again going back to developer2leader.com, if you hover over my photo, then you will notice that there is this really nice animation where the photo expands and increases in its size. That essentially is animation. Now, as the user is scrolling through the page, it's a nice thing to see, which makes the experience of developer2leader.com really nice. Animation definitely bring joy to our life in general, and they definitely add a bit of whimsy on our websites. Now, another concept in CSS that's extremely important is CSS variables. CSS variables are variables that you can use inside of CSS. They allow you to declare certain things in your page. For example, you can create a variable for something called as colors for your website. So for example, you could create a CSS variable for colors and define all these different colors, and then you can use colors.pink or colors.orange and so on to throughout your website. This creates a standard and a theme for your website that's really important. So anything that you want to use over and over again and you know you need to know the values of, or you might want to remember them, then you want to create a CSS variable for those. They are a way that you can store the values for these items in one place and then access them throughout your website. The next topic is responsive design. The responsive design in CSS is a way that you can use to make your website responsive. That means depending on the size of your device, whether it be tablet, mobile, or desktop, then you want to show a different layout to the user. You don't want the same experience of a desktop on a mobile device because you have less space and less real estate to use on a mobile device than on a desktop. You want to make sure that you design your application accordingly. So for example, if you head over to developer2leader.com, notice what you would accomplish towards the end of the program. These are all different cards that I'm using, and they also have this really slick animation as well. But now, when I change my viewport, that is, I change my desktop, I'm going to shrink it to tablet. Notice how the cards are shrinking, and now they are 2 columns. Now I could choose 3 columns in a tablet and 2 columns in mobile, but in this case, it made more sense for me to have 2 columns on tablet. So for example, if I again scroll down, you can see how my website has drastically changed to 2 columns and how the layout is shifting as well. Similarly, these cards are now smaller because I'm on a mobile device. So that is what I mean by responsive design. You need to make sure that your website's layout adapts to the device that the user is on, and this makes the app look really good as well. The last topic in this specific fundamental section is rem versus EM versus pixel, that is PX. Now, these are used to size the elements onto your page. For example, how we say this is going to be 10 centimeter or 1 inch and so on. These are different ways to measure. Similarly, if you want to measure things, want to say how you want to size different elements onto your page, then you either use rem or em or pixel. So for example, when it comes to font size, you always want to use rem. If you use rem for font size, it uses relative sizing. So depending on the size of your device, it is going to increase or decrease the font size. So that is why rem is definitely recommended, but em and pixel will be recommended in other cases. So these are different ways of measuring the elements on your page. Next, let's focus on preprocessors. So what exactly is a CSS processor? CSS processor gives you more superpowers to write CSS. It makes CSS more fun in my opinion. So as you get more superpowers for writing CSS, you write CSS in a specific way depending on the preprocessor that you choose, and eventually it will convert to regular CSS so that the browser can still understand. So that is the advantage of using a preprocessor. It makes your development really fast. And because the browser still has to understand simple CSS, the fact that it converts into regular CSS makes it really easy for us. Now, a few examples of preprocessors are Sass, Less, PostCSS, and Stylus. So now let's take a look at Sass. Now, like it says, CSS with superpowers. Now, why exactly do we need to use preprocessor like Sass, Less, PostCSS, or Stylus? Now, as your application grows and it gets bigger, you will not just have one single CSS file, you are going to have many CSS files and many lines of code. Now, in order for you to make sure that you are writing CSS that's maintainable, that anyone new that's joined your team can use it, and make sure that it's clean, you need to start thinking about solutions that will help scale your CSS file. So that is why you use solutions like Sass or PostCSS or Less or Stylus. For example, if we take a look at Sass example, if we go to learn Sass and go to the variable section, over here you can notice that on the left hand side we do write Sass code, which is a CSS file, and how it converts into CSS file on the right hand side. We are basically declaring variables and CSS variables, or Sass variables I should say, and then on the right hand side is automatically converting into CSS when it's time for the browser to use it. So that's how you can use preprocessors and take advantage of them as your application scales. But keep this in mind, for smaller projects, you don't need any of these preprocessors. When the application grows, when you're working in a team and a company, then it makes sense to use a preprocessor so your development gets faster and easier. Processes are great when your application grows and you have hundreds of CSS files, but they're not great for tiny apps. The next one is how you can organize your CSS. Like I mentioned, when your app is small, you don't need to know how to do all of this. But when your application grows, you need to know how you can write your styles, your CSS in a way without having to make it a mess, because as your application grows, you need to have some more standards and practices to help grow them and scale them. Here are a few ways you can organize your CSS. Again, Sass also helps you to do that, which is this specific language that we saw, Sass language. But at the same time, there's another website called as Atomic CSS that also allows you to write CSS. Now, with Atomic CSS, as you can see in the demo here, it's a CSS utility library that allows you to write small reusable CSS that just scales. So what you can do is you can create small classes, you can create small names, and that automatically will be converted into Atomic CSS. Now, keep this in mind, a CSS framework like Tailwind CSS does use Atomic CSS, which we'll talk about a bit later, but this is a great example if you want to use a small utility library that scales. So these are just a few ways you can organize CSS. Next is BEM. BEM, again, helps you create reusable components. So there are just different ways of scaling application. Each one has its own advantage. Again, I have never used BEM before, but this is another popular one in the industry that a lot of developers use. Now there's BEM, but there's also OOCSS, which is object-oriented CSS, which is another way of writing CSS. Similarly, there's also SMAX, which is scalable and modular architecture for CSS. It's another way of writing CSS and scaling them. So there are a bunch of different ways, but again, you don't need to necessarily focus on them. I would recommend you to learn Sass and Atomic CSS as starters, And then eventually, as you get more comfortable, start diving into others. But again, if you master two of them, one or two of them, then you don't necessarily need to know all of them. Now, there are some developers that already thought ahead. They thought that as they were trying to solve similar problems, they thought to package them up and solve a lot of problems for us so that when we write code, it's easier for us to use something that's already been adopted and loved by many other developers and that has become a standard in the industry. And that is where frameworks come along. Advantage of frameworks is that anyone can create a framework. They are essentially patterns and tools that are commonly adopted and used by many developers that have all been packaged up in one framework. So now CSS has a framework essentially designed to simplify our life, which is great. And also, it also helps speed up development because a lot of the problems, lot of the common problems are solved for us, and we are given the options of configuring certain things according to our application. So, for example, in CSS, there are quite a few frameworks. So, the first one is Tailwind. Then we have Bootstrap, Bulma, Radix UI, Tachyons, and there's other awesome CSS frameworks, Guide as well, that I will talk about and share. The first one is Tailwind. I freaking love Tailwind CSS. I am a huge fan. It has made my life so much simpler. So, for example, my website uses Tailwind CSS. My course website also uses Tailwind CSS. In fact, front-end snacks that we saw and any of my projects use Tailwind CSS because it makes my development a lot faster. So Tailwind really helps you create a bunch of names that comprises a bunch of CSS styles together. Rounded Excel will make your borders rounded automatically. So it creates a bunch of things that we can reuse and it makes our life really easy. And again, this is a utility-based CSS framework which is adopted with the same idea as Atomic CSS that we saw earlier, which is over here. So the same idea, but Tailwind CSS is really good. It provides you with a bunch of colors, bunch of standard spacing and fonts and typography. So you have a lot of it provided to you. So all you need to do is bring it all together like a bunch of Legos and then build your Lego set. And I have some good news. If you are interested in learning Tailwind CSS, then on my YouTube channel, I also have a free crash course for you that will walk you through everything that you need to know to learn Tailwind CSS. And it uses the same principles that I have used to build these gorgeous looking websites because Tailwind makes our life a lot simpler. And trust me, I am not a designer. I have learned design principles along the way, but because of Tailwind, I was able to create beautiful websites like developer2leader.com, kulkarniangita.com, frontendsnacks.dev, which all make my life really simple. So definitely check out Tailwind crash course if you like. It's on my YouTube channel. Then we have Bootstrap. Now, Bootstrap is a really old school way of doing things now. Bootstrap, once upon a time, was really popular. It was really popular because of their grid system. So, for example, if we head over to the Bootstrap documentation, over here you will see that they provided a system which no one had heard of. These are all the different grid options that we could use. These are all the different breakpoints that we can use that came out of the box from Bootstrap. And when newer libraries and frameworks took over, and we will talk about what libraries are in a bit, but as newer things came over, Bootstrap was no longer used. But once upon a time, Bootstrap was really popular. The reason why it was popular was also because it allowed us to do layouts way before Flexbox and Grid were available to us. So that's why Bootstrap was something that no one has ever heard of. But again, it's no longer used as much. Again, a lot of devs still use it, but it's not that popular for you to get a job. The other library is called Bulma. Now again, it's a CSS framework that just works. Then we have Radix UI, another way of maintaining and optimizing your CSS. Then we have Tachyons and a bunch more. So you will see all of these libraries over here that are mentioned, which are all the other awesome CSS frameworks that are available alongside CSS that you can use. Definitely check out this specific GitHub link, which has a links to all the different CSS frameworks. And what I love about it is that it also gives you how widely adopted it is, and a good demo, documentation, the repository, and so on, which is really awesome. Now, other option is CSS in JS. Now, CSS in JS is a way of writing CSS code inside your JavaScript code. And we haven't talked about JavaScript yet, but we will in right after this. So, it is a way that you can write JavaScript, and it was mainly introduced after React, which is a framework used for JavaScript, became really popular. We will also talk about React a bit later. But CSS in JS is again good to know, but you don't necessarily need to master. But there are a few different options of CSS in JS that you should know about. One of them is Stylix. Now, the Stylix is another library that you can use a lot, that is also introduced by Facebook to again make our life really easy. I have one more good news. I also have a video on this specific topic where I question if Facebook Stylix is a Tailwind CSS killer, and it's a really good video to watch if you are interested. Definitely check that out if you want to learn more about Stylix as well as Tailwind. Then we have CSS modules. Now, CSS modules are really great because, again, when you start writing more and more CSS, you need to come up with newer and newer class names. Typically, developers have a habit that they will name a few things, few elements jammed together as container. Now, you cannot have the same class name as container because remember, eventually browser is going to see that file and browser get confused. Which container are you talking about if you use the same name for everything? So that is why CSS modules are really good, because what they do is they convert the actual class name into a randomized class name, alphanumeric class name. So what happens is you can call as many containers as you like, because when it gets sent to the browser, it is actually this alphanumeric name which is being referenced, and it does it in a very performant way, so it's really good. Now we also have style components and emotions. So style components are again ways to create components and with styling in it. And also we have emotions, which is another way of writing styles with JavaScript for CSS. Now there are a bunch of different options, but I would, among these options, if you have to get started, I would recommend CSS modules first and then dive into the others. Now, frameworks and libraries are just ways for us to reuse some code that other developers have created for us. They are smarter than us, they think ahead, or they try a bunch of stuff and they already know that, hey, this is something that could be packaged into a library or a framework and other developers can take advantage of them. So what they do is they ship it to GitHub and then we can take advantage of it. Over time, more and more developers adopt those and they get really excited and start using it in their application. And as they start loving it because it makes their life really easy, it's easier to adopt, it's easier to maintain, doesn't compromise on performance, and so on, that's when they gain their popularity. And that's when companies start asking for them. Companies start using them in their actual applications that are used by millions of users. That's why it's really important to be aware of all these different frameworks and libraries, because it's going to make your development a lot faster and easier. Now that we know a little bit more about it, and we will learn the differences about what is a framework and a library more in depth in the JavaScript section. So let's dive in. Third very important skill is JavaScript. Now back to our diagram that we have been referencing throughout this video, how websites work. We learned HTML, no CSS now, and now it's time to focus on the third piece in the puzzle, which is JavaScript. JavaScript makes things really fun and makes website really fun. I still remember the time when I learned JavaScript back many years ago. I was able to add interactivity to my site and make my site a lot more dynamic with just JavaScript, and that made programming a lot more fun for me, and front-end development became a lot more fun. So that's why it's really important that you really focus on JavaScript. Add a little fun to your life. But truth be said, a lot of developers find JavaScript really hard because HTML and CSS is a lot simpler compared to what JavaScript does. But as you build websites, JavaScript becomes really powerful. Even though HTML and CSS make you a front-end developer, JavaScript is the missing piece in the puzzle which companies are looking for to truly consider you a solid front-end developer. Now here's what you can do with JavaScript. For example, if we head over to my site, kulkarniangita.com, if you want to add button clicks and add some interactivity with it, such as routing dynamically to a new page, for example, or submitting a call to the server, telling the server to do certain things, building games, then you want to use JavaScript. So now if we head over to our roadmap, let's go through the JavaScript section of the roadmap. Now, oh boy, we do have a lot to cover, but I'm really excited that you're getting a really good hold of front-end development. And I hope you get to the same point of excitement as I do, because front-end development is honestly really fun. And the more you build applications, the more you get used to it, the better developer you become. Definitely approach that with a growth mindset, which we will talk about later. So, what are some of the core fundamentals? Now, there are core fundamentals, there are libraries and frameworks, state management, build tools, and advanced knowledge. So, let's start with the core fundamentals that you need to know to master JavaScript. So, let's start with the basics. You need to learn all the basics to have a really good hold of JavaScript. Now, you need to know first how to code in JavaScript, because coding in HTML and CSS is a lot simpler compared to what you would do in JavaScript. But once you learn JavaScript, then you would be able to pick up any other programming language such as Python, Ruby, Java. You would be able to pick up any of these languages and more after you learn the basics of JavaScript, because every programming language has the same concepts of loops, conditionals, operators, different functions, arrays, objects, data types, and so on. So you would need loops whenever you have to go through a huge list of items. You would need conditionals when you specifically want to show, hey, if I'm logged in or not. So for example, right now I'm logged in, but the minute I hit log out, I get navigated to log out, and now I'm redirected to another page. This state itself is conditionals, where I check if the user is logged in, then show my name, else not. Then we have operators. Again, this will really help you figure out to add some things, subtract some things, and so on. Then we have functions. Functions are just like libraries, and they do perform specific operations, such as map would allow you to go through a list of items and manipulate the items. Filter, you can only pick one specific item from that list. Reduce will reduce, you can reduce a huge list of items into a small list if you want. Find will allow you to find items. Now there's a lot more to the list of JavaScript functions, but these are just a few that are really important. Functions are essentially reusable pieces of code. Now, arrays and objects allow you to really store the list of items, how you can manipulate those items, and so on. So for example, this box bracket is essentially an array, but this curly braces, whatever is in there, is an object, because an object contains a list of items, so does the arrays. We won't dive in too deep in terms of what each one of these do, but it should give you an overview of what each one does. Then we have data types that allow us to store data and really figure out what is the type of specific element. So for example, a name would be a type of string because it is literally text, and a number will be of type number, and so on. Imagine our data at the end of the day is we basically exchange data between computers. So whenever we do get the data back, we use a programming language and these data structures like arrays and objects to store that data, to store what we have received from the other computer. As you learn all of these, make sure that you learn to build simple apps and really build a solid foundation with these. Now, if you don't know any of these, then let's say if you don't know loops, then you will really struggle to grasp any of the future concepts or any of the advanced topics that we will be talking about later. So you really need to make sure that you have mastered all these basics in JavaScript to really get a good hold of JavaScript. Once you build a simple app, then you can build an app like Calculator. Then you can start listing down things from your favorite store, for example. Then you can start to list down things and make certain tweaks to the data of how that data gets shown. Then you can show that same data in different forms. Let's say you have a card, then you have a list, then you have some other fancy way of displaying that data. Again, the more you learn how to manipulate that data, that is change the data from one form to the other form, you are going to get better at JavaScript. But at the end of the day, once you learn JavaScript as a programming language, you will find it easier to pick up any new programming language, because just like you and I are communicating in English, it is a language that we are using to communicate. But let's say we were to learn a language like Spanish, a lot of the basics stay the same. We know how to communicate. We know the fundamentals of talking to each other. So it's just a matter of comparing, okay, if loops are done this way in JavaScript, then how do we do loops in Python? And so on. So the fundamentals stay the same. The last topic in the basic section is programming. Now, there are two different types of programming. One is functional programming, and the other one is object oriented programming. Now, functional programming and object oriented programming is essentially organizing your code. And they have slight variations on how you can write code, and they both have principles and rules around how you can write code. This type of programming allows us to work in a team where we establish a standard of practices that we can use to write our code, maintain our code, and scale our code. So now in object-oriented programming, the idea is that you want to create a structure, and that specific structure can be then used repeatedly to essentially write code. Whereas functional programming, just like we have map, filter, reduce, and so on, allows us to create functions that have the same output given the input. You basically create the functions, and no matter where you use that specific function, the output remains the same. But both of them allow us to write clean, maintainable code, which is really important. So I would recommend knowing the differences between them at a high level. Once you start working in a team, you will know what your team uses, and then you can start adopting one of them. But I would say that it would get easier for you as time passes. But knowing the differences would be key here. The next topic that we will focus on is DOM manipulations. Allowing things to change in the DOM is basically what JavaScript is all about. DOM represents the web page as a tree. So for example, if you go to my website and then head over to developer tools, and you can see whatever is in here is essentially the DOM. DOM stands for document object model. So whatever is in this specific document is the DOM. Whenever we are modifying our web page, that is our HTML code, so anything inside HTML tag is the HTML code, then in that case, whenever we modify the text on the page dynamically, basically means that we are updating the DOM. We are manipulating the DOM. So now, just for fun, we have hi, I'm Ankita. Now, over here, I know I'm doing this manually, but imagine like I change this to hey there. And instead of Ankita, I'm going to say subscribe and like this video. You can see now this text has completely changed from my name to this new text. That means I've updated the DOM. I've manipulated the DOM. Again, we need to do all of this through JavaScript. So in the browser, we have a new tab. We have a tab called console, and we can run any JavaScript code that we want. So if I say 1 plus 1, it's equals to 2, and the JavaScript code has essentially run. So this is what I mean by that. This is a console, a programming console that we can write any code in. Manipulations are literally ways to update the DOM of your page. DOM manipulations has this part called as event handling. Now, when we click a button, then that's an event. Let's say we are pressing a specific key on our keyboard, then that's a event. 90% of the time you're dealing with events in JavaScript. For example, like I said, this is a JavaScript console. So if I say hi, then an alert shows up called as hi. And this itself is also an event. So yeah, basically all of these are events in JavaScript that we need to learn how to manage. And in order for us to manage events and just in general JavaScript and to make it all scalable, now we are going to talk about a lot of other things to make it maintainable and scalable. One is EcmaScript. Now, EcmaScript is the governing body for what JavaScript should look like. So for example, this is essentially the specification that means how we should write JavaScript, where the JavaScript is headed, where JavaScript community is headed, and what the future of JavaScript looks like. It is a huge document, but it will tell you everything about how to write JavaScript. So every version of JavaScript comes up with a list of new features that have been taken into consideration based on community feedback, developer feedback, and in general. EcmaScript had a version of ES6, and this version is really going to go down in history because this version introduced so many cool changes in JavaScript, and I was really excited when this change was introduced. And these are all the different changes that have come up after ES6, which is EcmaScript 6 version. Now, even though it's ES6, it was released in 2015. So that's one thing you should know about. Now, after the ES6, there were many cool features that were released, such as arrow functions, promises, async programming, and so on. So let's say if I go to Google and add ES6 features, you can see all these different features that I didn't even mention all of them, but a lot of them are listed here as well. But these are all the important ones that I use constantly in ES6 and you need to know about. These additions essentially make the code concise, readable, and more powerful and gives you more power as a JavaScript developer. Definitely need to know all of these to master JavaScript. Now, I won't be going into all of these in detail, but one thing I would definitely talk about is async programming. Now, async programming allows us to get data from the server. So remember we talked about that the server is the one that stores data. Then in that case, async programming means ask the data from the server. Server is like, wait, hold on a second. I'm gonna go look for the data, tries to find it and gives it to us. And that can take a few milliseconds or it can take a few seconds. So async programming means that we don't necessarily have to wait. We just ask the server, hey, I want the data, give it to me whenever you are ready, and then get busy doing other things. And we use a function called as fetch to do that. Versus synchronous programming means that, hey, I'm waiting for you outside your door. I'm only gonna go and do other things once you give me the data. So that is synchronous programming. But async programming is quite popular in JavaScript. Again, if we go back to our browser console, there's a function called as setTimeout, which is a really good example for async programming. So now here, I'm gonna add an alert, hi, and I'm going to add that, hey, after 2 seconds is when I want this alert to show up. Now, this is an asynchronous function. So after I hit enter, I can get busy writing other things in the console. This is not going to block anything on the console. But if I hit enter, after 2 seconds, I'm going to get an alert. Now I can do whatever I want over here. I got back the hi message after 2 seconds. So that's what I mean. We can get that data after a certain period of time. Other topic is browser storage. Now, every browser has some storage associated to it. If you go to application, you will see the storage inside browser. But at the same time, if you scroll down, there's a specific dedicated storage section in each browser. This means that whenever we get data from the server, so whenever we ask for X data, we get back that data needs to be stored somewhere. We obviously store it in our data structures, in our programming language, but that means we also have some browser cache or some storage inside the browser where we need to store it sometimes. For example, if the user is logged in or not, is usually typically stored in the browser so that we don't need to check each and every time if the user is logged in. Just say that, hey, for 6 hours, keep the user logged in. But after 6 hours, let's check the user is if the user is still active or not. Otherwise, log them out. Things like that. So we have the option of local storage, then we have session storage. Now, both local storage and session storage are ways of storing data in the browser. Now, the next topic is error handling. Now, you need to know how to manage errors in JavaScript. If the user does give you bad data. Now, again, in this specific form, if the user gives me, instead of email address, they give me something else, then I need to tell them that, hey, this is wrong data, don't give me that. So I could add some sort of validation here, but again, you need to know how to handle those errors. So in case of spelling mistakes or just bad data, you know how to manage them. Next, let's talk about client rendering and server rendering. Imagine if the browser only got one huge JavaScript file. Browser is doing a lot of work. It is trying to figure out HTML, CSS, and trying to understand all the preprocessors. And even though we send browser what it needs to know, still browser is doing a lot of work. So that's when the concept of client rendering and server rendering came out. Whenever a user goes to a specific site, we want a really fast site just like this one. So in that case, we need to know if we can delegate some of that responsibility to the server. we need to know how we can do that. So client and server rendering are two different approaches you can use in web development for displaying content on the page. So now let's take a look at a diagram to understand better. Now we have this specific diagram, and I've used AI, which is Dolly, to basically generate this diagram for me, giving an analogy that I really think explains what client rendering and server rendering is. And client rendering, it's like the chef is giving you the dough, the sauce, cheese, toppings, and so on separately, which it's giving here. You have to use all these ingredients together to bake, and you bake it yourself at the table. Obviously, it might take some time. You get to make it exactly how you want because all these ingredients are separate. So in the world of web, where you're building a website, when you're visiting the website, it's like the kitchen is sending you parts of the web page. For the server is sending you part of the web page. It's like the kitchen is sending you parts of the web page, such as images, text, code, and so on. But it's not giving you the complete page. Your browser is going to act like you and the oven. They're going to put together all the ingredients together, show you the whole web page, one by one. Now this can take a bit of time because browser is going to figure out how to mesh all those things together. Because a web page gets complex as the application grows. That's what client rendering is. It's taking those ingredients one by one, and then it's the browser's job to put them all together. In complex application, it does take time. With server rendering, this time, the chef cooks the entire pizza. The chef is doing all the work in the kitchen, and they're giving you ready to serve pizza. And now, in the server rendering side, you get to enjoy the pizza right away. You may have to heat it, but you get to enjoy the pizza right away. That is exactly server rendering. So in the terms of website, when you visit a website, the server, which is a very powerful computer, which is located somewhere else, but prepares the whole web page for you. It will tell you exactly what it needs, and it's really fast, so it can figure out things very quickly. And it sends your browser a complete ready to go page. You see the web page immediately, just like you get a fully cooked pizza. And that is what server rendering is. So that's the difference between server rendering and client rendering. So that covers the core fundamentals of JavaScript, and we still have got quite a few things to go. But once you master JavaScript, you are already a front-end developer. You know exactly what you need to do to build a really good front-end application. Now, once you get familiar with it, you know exactly how that works, then you can start diving into libraries and frameworks that we will talk about now. Now, let's dive into libraries and frameworks. Now, in terms of libraries and frameworks, the first thing you need to know is what's the difference between a library and a framework. Now, I know we talked about this earlier, so now it's finally time for us to do that. Let's take an analogy of logos. Again, I've used AI to draw this. So on the left-hand side is a library, and the right-hand side is a framework. So a library is like a assorted Lego pieces without any specific instructions. It doesn't tell you what to do with it. It just has individual functional parts that make up Lego pieces. You have the freedom to use the Lego pieces the way you want to. So you can create your own custom designs, you could build your custom apps, and so on. So you can get creative, see what your needs are, and use the library for that. Versus a framework is essentially following a manual where it's already a Lego box which is predefined. Obviously, you can create your own, but there are already pieces that are functional that you can use, and a lot of it is done for you so that it's solving all the harder problems that you don't have to necessarily solve. So that's the advantage of using a framework. Now, on one side, a person is freely building a unique structure, getting creative, and they can do whatever they want. Now, developers can use whatever libraries they want, various components to fit their project. Versus on the right-hand side, it's predefined, it's structured. Developers are building specific patterns and have specific guidelines. And that is essentially the difference between a framework and a library. Because on the left-hand side is a library and the right-hand side a framework. So we have quite a few libraries and frameworks for JavaScript. So JavaScript on its own is typically known as vanilla JavaScript. JavaScript on its own is called as vanilla JavaScript, but you can add and use more libraries and frameworks to make it chocolatey or non-vanilla. So for example, the first one I want to talk about is jQuery. jQuery was really popular back in the day. In fact, in high school, I actually studied jQuery. jQuery is a JavaScript library. It allowed you to do a lot. All you needed to do was use this one line of script, embed it in your HTML, and use it right away. It was magical, to be honest. And even though jQuery was great, it was not necessarily maintainable. It was really hard to write code, and it wasn't great. It wouldn't scale as well. But jQuery has changed the way a lot of developers have written code. So I'm grateful for jQuery. But when libraries like React came along, I would say in 2013 onwards, React came out and it had taken the world by storm. It has not been accepted by developers at first, but Facebook developers were persistent, and then they decided to pitch React at a conference, and React was really widely adopted. And I would highly recommend you to check out the React documentary, how a small team of developers created React at Facebook. It's really awesome and really cool, and I highly recommend you to check it out. In this diagram, it is on the left hand side. So it will give you all the pieces necessary, but you still need to build a box of Legos yourself and make the decisions yourself. For an application to work well, it needs a few things. Going back to my website, it needs routing. So you need a way to navigate between different pages, for example. Then it also needs a way to update the data onto the page, update the DOM onto the page. You should be able to update the data dynamically really well. Your website should be fast, so it should be really performant. I don't want my users to wait for anything on my website. I want my website to be instant. A framework will do that for you. A framework will really allow you and give you all the power. So it will give you things like navigation, performance, but performance benefits out of the box. If you use specific components, then it will give you that right away. You don't need to solve a lot of problems on your own. But React is a library. It does give you a lot of Lego pieces without specific instructions, and we have the freedom to do whatever we want. Which is a difference between React libraries and React frameworks. Now, all of these are React frameworks, and this is a library for JavaScript, which is React. If I compare React with Next.js, that is a library with a framework, Next.js does give you a set of tools already. For example, if you use a Next.js image, then it is already performant. It gives you a router, which is used for navigating between pages. It gives you a lot of performance benefits out of the box. It has client rendering as well as server rendering that we saw earlier. In React, you can definitely do, but you need to figure that out yourself. So that is the difference between a framework and a library. But React is one of the popular ways of building websites. It has changed the way we build front-end application. One of the hottest jobs right now is actually in React, is for a React developer. So if I were to give you advice, or if I were to suggest, if I were a front-end dev starting now, I would 100% go for React, because React is really popular and widely adopted. Being a React dev also means you get to make a lot of money, which is not bad at all. And you will see a lot of jobs in React as well, truly hiring for React. So truly mastering React is really important. In order for you to truly master React, these are all the topics that you need to know about. JSX, state versus props, class and functional components, understand how to build component architecture, hooks, memoization, context, profiler, suspense, and so on. I highly recommend you to go through these topics. Hooks are definitely really important for you to build components. Not new, but they're still fairly new to being adopted. Memoization is a performance thing. Context allows you to store data that you get from the server. Then React Profiler is again a performance thing. So for example, if we head over to the browser DevTools, then we will get an option for a React Profiler. You will be able to measure the performance of your application, for example. And suspense will allow you to display like a loading UI if the data from the server is really slow. And then lastly is create React app. Now, create React app was the standard way for many years to create a React project. But with frameworks like Next.js, Remix, Astro, and so many others, React team is recommending the devs to go for frameworks. So, for example, if you go to learn React, and if you head over to starting a new project, they recommend using Next.js, Remix, Gatsby, Expo for React Native, and so on. The other frameworks that are popular for JavaScript are Next.js, which is for React, Remix is for React, Astro for React, SvelteKit for Svelte, Redwood, which is a full stack framework, Vue, and Angular. Now, all of these frameworks are popular, but if I were to recommend, I would recommend the top three. I do want to add a note about Angular. Angular is still being adopted by a lot of enterprise companies. So if you want to go in a niche market, then definitely go for Angular and try to look for specific Angular jobs because Angular is still being widely used. But if you want to make sure that your skills are up to date and you're using modern tools, then definitely go for top three. Now, Remix and Astro both are quite new, but still Remix has been already acquired by Shopify, and Astro is really getting popular already. So I would definitely learn these two. But if I were to prioritize, definitely prioritizing Next.js. And I also have a course on Next.js that you should check out. Now, Next.js is quite popular because it is a really popular production framework for React. It enables you to create full stack applications. And full stack means it allows you to do front end as well as back end in Next.js itself. And it's pretty cool. I truly believe in the future of Next.js, and it has a lot of things out of the box that makes an application complex, which is routing. Then it gives you performance benefits out of the box. It has image optimizations, so images will load faster. For example, on a website like Amazon, there are too many images, and this truly allows you to load those images and cache them and has some performance benefits already. The thing I really love about Next.js is that it's only going to load the images that you see on the viewport. But as you scroll down, that's when it will download the other images, which that means the first load of the website when the user visits Amazon.ca is really fast. So Next.js really is pretty cool. But then there's also Remix, for example, which is acquired by Shopify and built by great developers that I really look up to. And these are the docs for them. I really love their documentation so far. And Remix again has different ways of building modern web applications. So again, another one to check out as well. And we have Astro as well. All of these have similar capabilities. They all allow client and server-side rendering. They give you dynamic API web points. They do a lot of stuff already. But so it's all about picking what resonates with you and what your team is using. Overall, I would say that Next.js has higher chances of getting you a job compared to the other two. So I would focus on Next.js if you really want to focus on job. The other section in Java in libraries and frameworks is component libraries. Now again, component libraries are just reusable code that other developers have built, and so that we can reuse that. Only open source, that means it's free of cost and anyone can use it. You can also contribute to it and help it to make it better. And if there are common problems that front-end developers often come across, then they use component libraries for that. Then they build component libraries. So whenever you have to build something, instead of building it from scratch, try to look if there is a component library for it, as long as the program is big enough. So for example, a popular library for searching for components is npmjs.com. Here, if I say charts, then you will see that I do get a bunch of different options, a bunch of different chart libraries already that I could use, and I can literally check which has more adoption. So for example, this was last published 10 years ago, so I'm not gonna go for that, but I could literally click on popularity, optimal, or maintenance, and then now you can see I got a library that was published 3 days ago with weekly downloads of more than 6,000. So this is a library I'm gonna go for. But you can look for a library that solves your problem instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. But there are a few component libraries that I really like. One is ShatCN, which is quite new, and it gives you a lot of components out of the box, and it has made development a lot simpler, and it's quite popular. So if I were to learn a specific component library, it would be this one. Then we have Next.UI, which is also a really good option as well. Then we have Tamagui, which is again helps, it's for React as well as React Native, and React Native is for mobile applications. And then we also have Tailwind UI, which again, Tailwind gives you a bunch of different components altogether that you can use onto the pages. So these are some component libraries that really work well with JavaScript and all these different frameworks. Next topic is state management. At the end of the day, all we are getting is data back and forth. So for example, this is how websites work. We ask for data and we get data between computers all across the world. So state management is all about maintaining the data and manipulating the data. Now, even though libraries and frameworks do help manage state, their main job is to do a lot of things, including manage state. As the application grows, so does the data. So it's really important that we have a dedicated library for managing state. And depending on the framework you go for, there are quite a few. For example, we have Context, Redux, Apollo Client, Recoil, Justine, and MobX. All of these are great options, but I highly recommend you to go for Context if you're using React for smaller applications. But if as your application goes, try going for Redux. And if you're going for Vue, then there's Vuex and NGRX for Angular. Apollo Client for GraphQL is something that you would use if your team uses GraphQL specifically, and then they're trying to integrate Apollo Client on top of that. Then we have Vue.js. Now Vue.js, even though is quite popular, it is definitely adopted by a lot of different devs. I would still say that in terms of jobs, Next.js is quite up there. So I would still highly recommend Next.js. Next, let's talk about build tools. Build tools help a lot during your development. They do the heavy lifting for your app so that browser can receive the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files in the most performant way possible. Let's take a look at it one by one. So the first one is module bundlers. Now, there we have quite a few module bundlers such as Webpack, Parcel, Rollup, and Turbopack. So let's talk about first of all what module bundlers are to begin with. So module bundlers are essentially ways to bundle your modules. Now imagine your website is really small at first, right? It only has a few things, and then as your application grows, as your website grows, then you have images, you have text, typography, and then you have hundreds and thousands of files. Now it can get really hard to manage, and that is where module bundlers come in play. They bundle everything together in the most efficient way possible because they know everything about your development environment and the kind of production environment you want to create as well. So module bundlers really help with that. So the most popular one that I would recommend learning about is Webpack. Now again, any of these module bundlers, you don't necessarily need to know all their config, you don't need to memorize any of their stuff. Really good idea to keep a high level understanding of what they do. So if you do get asked during interviews or for your knowledge as well, then you would be able to answer them. The most popular one that I would recommend learning about is Webpack. Now, what exactly is Webpack? Well, Webpack is a really powerful module bundler. It will make sure that it is packaging all your HTML, JavaScript, and CSS files in the most efficient way possible. It does give you a bunch of different configs that you can use with Webpack, that you can just use it to bundle it. So for example, the left-hand side is the Webpack config file where you write your code for Webpack. And all you're saying is, hey, take the entry point for this specific JavaScript file and put it all and compress it in a bundle.js file. Now, there are a bunch of different performance techniques that you can also apply within Webpack, but Webpack overall makes it really easy, and you can go through the documentation to basically learn all of this in general. So Webpack is quite powerful. And if I were to give you an analogy, you can think of Webpack as someone who's trying to organize a party. Webpack is great at organizing big parties. They are efficient in bringing all of your friends together and making sure it's the best party ever, because you have snacks, you have different types of food items, you have drinks, and so on. So Webpack is that big party planner that you can think of, as it knows and meticulously goes through every detail about your friends and make sure that they throw the best party. The next one is Parcel. The Parcel, I would say, is a more straightforward, easygoing party planner, and it's really good for smaller parties. For example, Parcel is really good for smaller parties. It really gives you a out of the box development experience, which allows your project to scale. It's really good to put together a project really quickly and efficiently, but again for smaller projects. Then we have Rollup. Now, Rollup is again a JavaScript module bundler, and again you can compile small pieces of code into something large and complex. Now, you would typically use Rollup in a place where you are creating your own library. So, let's say you have a piece of code, or you write a bunch of utilities, or a bunch of code that you want other people to use as well. Let's say you want to create a library on parsing different dates and giving them the correct format, for example. Then in that case, you can use Rollup to create your own module, and Rollup can basically be that module. Rollup will be that module bundler for you, which will compile all the files together and put it all together in the most efficient way possible. So again, going back to our analogy, Rollup would be a party planner which is pretty niche. It does specific things and for specific purpose. So make sure you use Rollup for that. Just are great to know. These module bundlers are great to know, but make sure that you focus on Webpack. The rest of them just learn them at a high level. Then the last one is Turbopack. Now, Turbopack is a Rust powered successor to Webpack. Now, they really wanted to make Webpack fast, and with Turbopack, they're basically using Rust, which is a low level language, to basically compile files faster so you get additional performance benefits and so on. Now, you can go through the docs for Turbopack, but Turbopack is essentially quite fast and it's written in Rust by the creators of Webpack and Next.js at Vercel. Really helps you to bundle your files together, and it's really great for large applications. But again, it's still in beta at the time I'm recording this specific video, so make sure that it's good to be aware where the web is heading, but don't use it yet. Just focus on Webpack. Then we have Npm Scripts. Now, Npm Scripts allow you to automate tasks by giving it a specific name in your package JSON file. So if there is a command that you keep repeating, then you can basically create an Npm script for it. So for example, let me walk you through Frontend Snacks. Now, this is the repo for Frontend Snacks, and you don't necessarily need to know any of the code for Frontend Snacks, for example. And Frontend Snacks is a newsletter that I showed you earlier. But in this specific repo, you can see this specific scripts section. This script section is the Npm scripts. Now we have a dev script, you have a build script, start script, and lint script. Now, the dev script will essentially start the Npm server. So for example, if I go to my terminal and add npm run dev, then this would mean that it would start a development server. But I cannot just run this script anywhere I like. It has to be inside of Frontend Snacks, which is located here. So if I run npm run dev here, now you can see that you can ignore the warnings, but now you can see that I can just start up my local development server thanks to npm script. So now Frontend Stacks is ready to go. But that's the power of using npm scripts. You basically can add any script that you want. Now the next one that we will take a look at is development utilities. Again, like the name indicates, development utilities really help you speed up your development. It helps you in checking, writing, formatting, prettifying your code. And there are quite a few development utilities. And I would recommend learning all of them because they are really important. That's why there is a rocket sign here. So let's take a look at Babel first. Now, Babel is a JavaScript compiler. Now, what exactly is a compiler? Now, a compiler will take one language and basically give you files for some other language. So it's going to allow us to use the latest JavaScript features and write the code the way we want to, with the latest features, with the latest specification. And Babel will still turn it into the typical JavaScript code that our browsers understand. So this means that it's going to make the JavaScript compatible to all browsers, even though they might not be using the latest JavaScript specification. So Babel is pretty cool for that. The next one that we will take a look at is ESLint. Now, ESLint will basically, like the hero banner says over here, it will find and fix problems in your JavaScript code. Now, as we start typing, we really want to make sure that we're not making any mistakes. For example, if you start typing in English, you could use an app like Grammarly that will check for spelling mistakes, that will correct your sentences, that will make sure that you are forming proper sentences, and so on. ESLint does the same thing for JavaScript, where it will find and fix your problems in your JavaScript code. And it will also make sure that everyone in your team follows the same grammar or follows the same type of coding style that is declared in ESLint so that there's consistency all across the board. So definitely check out ESLint for that, and you should definitely learn ESLint. Now, the next one is Prettier. Now, Prettier complements ESLint quite well. So if we try Prettier online right now, so on the left hand side, you can see that the code is written in a quite an ugly way. It's not formatted well, but on the right hand side, it is properly formatted. And that is the advantage of using Prettier. Prettier will automatically format your document based on the type of styles that you ask Prettier to do. Again, when you're coding on your own, this doesn't really matter that much. In fact, I would definitely say formatting your code would help even if you're coding alone. But let's say when you're coding in a team, this matters even more. You want to make sure that you agree with your team upon a common set of styles so that not everyone is writing code in one way, whereas your other teammate is writing code in some completely different way, and it gets really difficult to review code. So, for example, on the left hand side, if you were to review this hello world function, and if one of your teammates write the hello world function in this way, and then some other person writes the code in this way, is what's shown on the right hand side, then obviously it gets really hard to read. So, you want to make sure that you agree to a standards. It's quite funny, but a really common argument among developers is that whether you should use spaces or tabs as a prettier code formatting style. It is a huge argument in the JavaScript community, which is hilarious. So, if you want to go for this, is using double space, but a tab would mean four space, for example, over here. So, that's what Prettier does. The last one is JSConfig or TSConfig. Now, again, JSConfig or TSConfig are complementing ESLint and Prettier as well. What they essentially do is that in JavaScript and TypeScript, you can use certain things and you cannot use certain things. This is also something that you need to agree upon with your teammates and come up with a standard that works for you. For example, you're going to use ES6 and so on. Now, these are a few development utilities that help. The next one is Gulp. Now, Gulp is extremely powerful and useful. Not everyone uses it, but this is really good to know. Again, when you have a few things that you really want to automate, a combination of different commands or tasks, then you can use Gulp for that. So it will automate and enhance your workflow while coding JavaScript applications. So, for example, things like if your file is getting too long, let's just minify it. Or when you type your code, let's just save it. As you're typing it, you want the code to be saved, then you can use Gulp for that as well and set up a command for that. But obviously, there are Prettier and ESLint for that as well. But Gulp will really help you automate a lot of your tasks so that you don't have to do it because it gives you a bunch of handy functions in general. Then the next one is Vite. The correct pronunciation is Vite. Vite is a really fast next generation front end tooling. It is a modern front end build tool. It improves your development experience when building web applications. Now, if you want to start a project, you can definitely use Vite for that reason. Vite is already used inside Vue.js that we saw earlier, but if you go to the new React documentation, and if you click on Learn React, then installation section and starting a new React project, the next React official React docs recommend using frameworks. But let's say you don't want to use frameworks, then it does recommend using something like Vite or Parcel and add these packages, React and React DOM from npm, and to set up your build process using Vite or Parcel. So this is pretty handy. So you can use Vite for that reason as well. And it's a really powerful development and bundle tool if you don't want to use frameworks. So, in terms of best buddies, you could think of Vite and Rollup are best buddies, Webpack and Create React app are best buddies, Webpack and other frameworks. And I should also say that Vite and Create React app as well, and Vite and React as well are best buddies, but not many people are adopting it yet. But you can still use Vite together with React if you don't want to use any of the frameworks that I've mentioned earlier. Now that we went through some of the build tools and the basic knowledge of JavaScript, let's talk about some of the advanced knowledge that I would recommend you to get into once you get familiar with JavaScript and now you are quite confident with it. So these are a few topics. Next topic is TypeScript. TypeScript is loved by so many. It is a superset of JavaScript and it allows you to add something called as types to JavaScript. So for example, let me show you something. Now, let's say I open up my browser developer tools and I'm going to create my console. And here, let's write a simple function. We can say something like add that takes, let's say, two numbers, number 1 and number 2. And then here, we're going to say that you want to return the addition of 2. So num1 plus num2. And what we want is when I say add, I'm going to say 2, 3, and it should give me 5. But watch what happens. Now, let's say I say Enkita, YouTube, for example. Then a string concatenation, which is that Enkita, YouTube also gets combined together. Now, initially, when I thought of writing this function, I was thinking numbers. But now I could also add strings next to each other, which is kind of cool, but not something that I want. And that is the benefit of TypeScript. If I were to write the same function inside of TypeScript, then I would declare and say that, hey, this is a number and this is also a number. Now, and then enter it. Now, obviously, at the same time, I can also say, hey, I want the return type to also be a number, for example. Now, keep this in mind that the reason why I got an error here is because the browser does not recognize TypeScript. We used all the module bundlers that we talked about to essentially bundle it and compile it to another language altogether, which is JavaScript. In our actual code, in our code environment, if TypeScript is set up, then this would work. So this is just an example of what TypeScript does. The reason why we need mainly TypeScript is to give that type for JavaScript, because otherwise you can add whatever you want in functions in JavaScript. You can make it whatever you want it to be. With types, it makes it a strongly typed language, which means that it gives you better tooling and it tells developers that, hey, don't add a string here, or check and make sure that you only add numbers in that specific code. So that's what TypeScript does and the benefit of it. We need to convert TypeScript code to JavaScript code so the browser can understand. So definitely we need to do that. But it does allow you to add guardrails around it. But TypeScript is a huge topic and is very popular. And like these are all the different topics that you should know to basically learn TypeScript. But here's the thing, it doesn't have a rocket sign next to it because it is not recommended for beginners. I would just start with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript with all the rocket science that I've talked about so far to become a front-end developer. I would not focus on TypeScript. But whenever you're ready, definitely learn these things to get really strong. Now, the next topic that we should focus on is internationalization. And there's a popular library called I18N that allows you to translate one language to the other. So, for example, if we go to amazon.ca, and if we want to go to this background, this drop down and change it to French, then I'm going to get French language. But if I change it to English, then I'm going to get English language, for example. So with this drop down, what Amazon does is that it switches all the language, that is all the text language on the website to French. So they basically have like two files, an English file and a French file, where they have official translators translating that. Now, even though browsers do offer translating your text, just like we saw, we cannot guarantee that it will be accurate. But for sites like Amazon, it is really important that they do offer those translations in all languages, otherwise, they're going to miss out on customers. So that's why internationalization comes in play there. Again, this is an advanced topic that you should be aware of, that this is how it's done. And there's a popular library called I18N that you need to use for that. But again, don't worry too much about it. Now, the next topic we will talk about is server-side rendering. Now, we talked about the differences between the two, client-side as well as server rendering. Now, keep this in mind, server rendering is definitely a way where you basically get the server to do majority of the work and you get a ready-made pizza, and all you need to do is heat it up and eat it. So that's the advantage of server-side rendering. But there are quite a few frameworks that offer server-side rendering out of the box. So if you do want it and if you have to opt for it, I would recommend these three, the top three that are really popular. But among the three, I would highly recommend Next.js. Even the React documentation talks about these frameworks, but Next.js is more popular compared to Remix, but Remix is also slowly getting there. Now let's talk about one of my favorite topics in the advanced section, which is performance. Now, once you get through the beginner stage of development to get to intermediate and more so senior dev as a front-end developer, what will truly differentiate you is your in-depth knowledge. So for that, performance is a very important topic that you really need to master. Performance would mean that what are some techniques that we can apply during development while architecting and building our JavaScript applications so that one, our applications scale, and second, when a user goes to your website, it's really fast. It is not slow. Because remember, if you're working for, let's say, Amazon or a big e-commerce store that gets hundreds and thousands of users on the site, you really want to make sure that they're not waiting around a few seconds for the website to load. They're just going to close the tab and move on to something else. That's not what you want. So what you need to do is you really need to master performance for that. And let's go through this list one by one. So understanding web vitals. So for example, web vitals are a few core metrics that Google and a lot of search engine uses to measure how fast our website is. So how fast it loads, how quickly a user can interact with it, what is the SEO like? Like, are you using best SEO practices? How accessible it is? When your website loads, does it immediately shift the content when more content loads? Now, this website, web.dev, is amazing for performance. If you really want to make sure that you are getting good at performance, go through the articles on this specific website first before going to anything else, because it will teach you how to build really fast websites. So, as part of that, as part of web.dev, Web Vitals is an article that you should definitely read to really understand what those web vitals are, accordingly see how you can improve your web vitals. Now, based on the web vitals, Google is also working on getting your site to rank higher if your web vitals are good. If not, then not so much. The next topic is using the CDN. Now, if you remember, when we talked about the internet, we talked about how the internet works, where one server, one computer talks to the other computer, and so on. Now, let's say we put all these computers together in a network. So, for example, in a smaller network, that itself is called CDN, which is a fancy term known as Content Delivery Network. Basically, all you need to know about CDN is a network of computers talking to each other. Now, whenever I go to frontendsnacks.dev, what my hosting provider is going to do is, which is Vercel, is going to look for my nearest computer to me. It's going to ask the CDN network that, hey, which is the nearest computer? And that server is going to do the work to get my websites, HTML, JavaScript, and CSS files. So that's the benefit of using CDN. Using CDN, it's like a computer that will store all your content, it's ready to go, and you don't have to worry about it. That's the benefit of using CDN. Then we have lighthouse testing audits. If we go to frontendsnacks.dev, you will notice here you can generate a lighthouse report. And this is when you open your browser development tools and go to the tab Lighthouse. Now, if you click on Analyze Page Load, then you can essentially analyze your page load based on a few core web vitals that we talked about, and performance, accessibility, best practices, SEO, and progressive web app. You can choose to test it on mobile as well as desktop. If I click on Analyze Page Load, it will generate a report for me and suggest a few improvements as well. Now, that is the advantage of using Lighthouse testing audits. Now, just because you get a score of 100 on Lighthouse does not mean that your website is performant. You still need to do a lot of other performance benchmarks and techniques to make your application performant. But Lighthouse is a good thing to know to make sure that you know what you're doing. Then we have Google Page Speeds Insights. Again, it tells you how fast your website is. So you can enter any URL that you like on this specific website, and then you can analyze the page speed. Now, there are a lot more performance techniques that we won't be necessarily going through, but all you need to know is these techniques are something you can basically apply in your application using module bundlers such as Webpack so that you can make your application performant. Lazy loading would be, for example, you only want to show the cards that are already on the viewport. So for example, right now this is my viewport, this is my computer screen. I don't want the rest of the content to load at all. Lazy loading would be I load this content as I scroll to the page. So that's what lazy loading is. The next one is code splitting. A code splitting would mean that instead of getting a huge JavaScript bundle file to the browser, we only give it the file that it cares about, the code that we are showing onto the page, and we split it into small chunks so that it's easier for browser to download and handle. So that's what code splitting is. Again, you can do this in Webpack and other module bundlers. Then you can optimize the images, so only show the images you want. Show a smaller image on mobile device versus a bigger image on desktop. Then minify all your files. So if you remove unnecessary spacing, if you remove unnecessary words or code that you're not necessarily using onto the page, then get rid of them. Minifying would help with that. Then again, compressing your file. Then we have one more caching where we can use a tool like Akamai, for example, which will basically cache all your data on the nearest server. So for example, this specific navigation that I have, home, blog, free goodies, it's pretty simple, it's pretty small. But let's say if you go to a site like Amazon, this navigation is quite intense. This specific list of categories can change a lot. Now, in that case, you could just store all those navigation items in a service like Akamai, basically a CDN, which will store all your items that you want, and it will get it to you, and it will cache it for you, so you don't have to retrieve it over and over again by calling the server. Then again, we have critical rendering, path optimization, and tree shaking. These are all advanced concepts that you need to learn in performance. Next, let's talk about testing. Now, testing your code is extremely important. For example, there are different types of testing you need to perform to make sure your code is properly tested. Now, as much as we want to write bug-free code and we want to call ourselves the best developers that don't have any bugs, it's really important to test your code just to make sure you haven't accidentally introduced a bug or introduced something, or your teammates haven't introduced a bug or systems, and so on. As your code base grows, bigger JavaScript file, HTML and CSS files, there are more chances that you might make a mistake. So, and you might not have context of such a huge code base because there are thousands of files. In that case, testing is really, really important. Now, there are a few ways you can test things inside your code base. Let's talk about the types of testing. There are different ways you can test your code. Now, depending on the application you're building and how big or small it is, accordingly pick the type of testing that might be good. For example, the first one is unit testing. In unit testing, you're testing your code in isolation and you're not worrying about the rest of the code at all. So, say you're testing the total price of the shopping cart. So, if we go to Amazon.ca, right now I don't have anything in my cart, but let's say I add a product in my cart, then let's say I only have the function of calculating the total of that specific item. Then, in that case, that code itself should be tested on its own, and that is called unit testing. So, for example, I have one more newsletter called as Engineering Leadership Snacks.dev. This is for folks who want to grow as engineering leaders. And again, it's a similar idea to Frontend Snacks.dev. Let's say I want to add a snapshot test for this specific newsletter. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a photo of this, like a screenshot of this, but in code. And then anytime I push the code, I'm going to check, hey, was anything changed on the banner? Because I didn't make any changes in the code for that. Did something change? If the answer is no, then it's good. But let's say I was using something common and I accidentally updated some text by mistake, then my test should fail. And that is the idea of snapshot testing. You can basically take snapshot of your existing UI. Then we have regression testing. Let's say you join an existing team and the code base is huge. There are so many files, like hundreds of files, and the likelihood of you making or breaking a change is massive. When you do introduce your new changes, you're making sure that you don't cause any regression. That is, you don't cause any bugs in the existing system. So you make sure that you test out everything, existing systems and the new changes and so on. And that's called regression testing. So you want to read on your existing tests, make sure you're testing all the scenarios so that your regression testing will well. Then we have integration testing. Integration testing would be that how one or two modules would work together. Again, going back to Amazon.ca, integration testing would be how shopping cart would probably work really well with the different product pages, for example. Now, you want to make sure that you use integration testing for that. Then we have cross browser testing. I am on the Chrome browser, but let's say I were to open Safari, for example, then how does my website perform on Safari? It's quite fast, it works, but this itself is called cross browser testing. I'm making sure that whatever browsers I've agreed to support to my users, they are being cross browser tested. Let's say we have millions of users visiting your website, then in that case you want to make sure that your website can handle the load for that. In load testing, what happens is we are going to give a fake load, so fake millions of users, and see how your website performs. There are a bunch of different tools for that, but I would highly recommend using this only when you get to that many users. So what you're doing is you're simulating a load testing. A popular example is during Black Friday. Suddenly, so many websites go down. For example, I remember Target had gone down, or the website Best Buy had, which is in Canada, had gone down because there were so many users accessing the websites during Black Friday trying to take advantage of the sales, or some new sneakers come out, or some new product is out like Xbox. Then you want to make sure that you load test your site so that it doesn't break. Then we have performance testing. Again, we talked about this in the performance section. The code that you write performs well in terms of all the soft performance criteria that we talked about. Now let's talk about the libraries we can use for testing things. So the first one is Jest. Now, Jest is a very popular library in JavaScript. It is mainly used as a testing framework that is used for unit testing your code. So for example, if you want to test your code in isolation and make sure that it works as expected, then you would use something like Jest for that. And if you want to just sum up the total and you want to test that out, then you would use something like Jest for that reason. The next example is React Testing Library. Now, React Testing Library is honestly one of my favorites, and this library truly changed how I write tests in general, because you want to write maintainable tests for your components. It's a React testing library, it's a testing library for React. And what you do is you think about your end user and how the user is going to test your code, and then that's how you write tests accordingly. I highly recommend this library whenever you get started working in a team, or you want to test your code in general, test your React components in general, because this is really good. I truly respect him, and I love how React Testing Library has changed everything. Then we have Mocha Chai. Mocha is a feature-rich JavaScript test framework as well. And Chai is a assertion library, for example. So you could check things like, hey, does foo match should be a string? Does this specific foo has a value of bar, and so on. So Chai really helps with that. It provides you a test framework so you can write tests easily. And Mocha is the one that will run the test. Chai is the one that will assert the test. That's also really popular. Then the other one is Jasmine. Now, Jasmine is again simple JavaScript testing in the browser. You can run your browser test for that. And what it does is it's a behavior driven test. That means that you can, if let's say there's a bug, there's a specific behavior to that. then you can perform those specific steps and test that in Jasmine, and test that behavior in Jasmine specifically, and write tests for that. So make sure you use Jasmine for that. Then we have things like Enzyme. Now Enzyme is also again a JavaScript testing utility specifically for React as well, which again makes your assertion easier. I mean, all the tests are supposed to do is that if I give this input, does this give me output? If I click these three places, does this expected thing happen? That's exactly what all these libraries are doing. And lastly, we have the library Karma, which is again a very useful library. It's pretty simple and it acts as a test runner, similar to Mocha, right, that we saw. But Karma is specifically used for testing cross browsers. So you can check, you can introduce your test code and then make sure it works well on different browsers. Then these are the libraries that we have. Let's focus on end-to-end testing. End-to-end testing basically means that we are basically checking how the user would test your code. So let's say they add items to cart, then they check out. All of that, it would go in end-to-end testing. So the part that I'm going to Amazon, I go to today's deal. So I'm testing, let's say, today's deal feature and the ability to add the cart completely. I'm going to go to quest bars. I'm going to add to cart. I'm going to proceed to checkout. And all of this, I'm able to log in and so on, is a part of end-to-end testing. We are making sure that the entire end-to-end behavior works as expected. Then we have quite a few libraries for that. One is Cypress. So let's take a look at Cypress. Again, you can create tests for modern web apps and debug them easily. You can run those tests. Then we have Selenium, which again automates the browsers completely. We have Test Cafe, which is actually a really fun solution. It's a user-friendly end-to-end testing solution. So it also comes up a lot. And then we also have Mabel, which is again similar idea, where in Mabel, all you need to do is click, 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 and then that automatically captures the behavior, and then you don't even have to necessarily write a lot of code. It will regenerate a lot of the code for you. So that's why it's a low code test automation that scales. So all of these are viable options for end-to-end testing. Oh boy, we have covered quite a few things in the front-end landscape. We now know what HTML is, CSS, JavaScript is, what is the basic knowledge we need to know. At the same time, what is some of the advanced knowledge? We have libraries, frameworks, we learn the differences between the two. Then we also learn which state management libraries to go for specific frameworks and so on. How to bundle your project, how to make it pretty, how to scale our project, how to test our project, and so on. We have learned a lot so far. So now it's time for us to basically figure out the last few topics, which are also essential to make sure you become a very successful front-end developer. Now let's cover a topic called as static sites. Now, static sites are essentially sites that only have content on your page. They don't have a lot of dynamic stuff, for example. So a good example would be my blog. So now if we go to my blog over here, this would essentially be a static site. It has a bunch of text and the user can mainly interact with this heart. But overall, it has only a bunch of text and you can just view the text and read the blog. There's not much to it. But as we talk about static sites, we have to talk about something called as JamStack. So what exactly is JamStack? Well, JamStack is an architecture which is designed to make the web faster, secure, and easier to scale. Let's try to understand what JamStack is and why it got created to begin with. Well, as the web started to get bloat, initially it was just pure HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Then there was the evolution of jQuery. Then we had so many libraries and frameworks that were added on top, which truly bloated our front end overall. A simple application now is quite complex. Then we got module bundlers to make it performant. Then we have linters and Prettier. That doesn't necessarily ship to production, but it does increase our build time because now we have to package all of that together and make sure we are shipping a really scalable application that is quite performant. This means that when a user goes to our website, it's going to now take longer. Why? Because our application has so many different library code, which basically compiles down to plain JavaScript code, but that code also needs to be included in the browser. Browser needs to know what those functions are so we can call that specific function. For example, browser does need to know this heart functionality so that when I click on this heart, it does go increment the count. That is why Jamstack got created. And here is how Jamstack basically works. But before that, let's try to understand how the traditional workflow is, and then we can go with the Jamstack workflow. Traditional workflow, let's say this is a developer. Let's call this developer Sean. Now this Sean developer is quite dedicated at his job. So what he does is he has his blog and he has a passion for cookies. And he's like, I'm gonna write about the cookies that I've been baking and cooking and so on. So what he does is he writes his blog all about cookies. He's also a developer. So what he does is he ships the blog code to the server ilovecookies.com, which is awesome. He ships that blog code to the server, which is right here. Then he has already given the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files to this specific server. A user who's also interested in cookies, probably me, because I love cookies, then I'm gonna say, hey, show me the cookies. And I search for chocolate cookies, chocolate chip cookies, cinnamon raisin cookies, and so on. And then what I'm doing is, as Sean told me about his website, I'm going to ilovecookies.com. And as I do that, what happens is my computer is going to make a call to the server where Sean has shared all his code. The server is like, sure, let me produce all the HTML on demand. And here you go. Here is ilovecookies.com. It's a simple blog. Sean has not added anything complex. And I'm able to read more cookies content. So it's a win-win. So this is what a traditional workflow is. It's a simple blog, ilovecookies.com. It's not that complex. What we have done is the server is basically producing the content that's needed on demand and giving it to the user. But as the web has evolved more and more, that's when Jamstack was like, hey, when it's a simple site like ilovecookies.com, why not pre-build a lot of the HTML and keep it on the server? So whenever a user does ask, we can just give it to the user. Why do we need to produce it on demand? We don't need to do that. We can just do it. A simple site like cookies changes its workflow. So developer Sean still pushes the code, writes his blog on cookies, he will build his code, he will bundle the code, and then he will ship the bundle file to the server on ilovecookies.com. So he'll give his HTML, and he will now, instead of giving to some server, he's going to give it to a content delivery network, which is a fancy term for a collection of servers. So what happens is, whenever a user, let's say that user is in somewhere like India, then a server from Canada is not going to be called. Content delivery network is going to figure out, okay, the user is in India, so the server closest to that user is going to have all the files. So when someone from India requests for I love cookies, then the CDN is like, I have already pre-built the files because Sean gave me all the build files, so here you go. And it's going to be instant. It's going to be really fast. And that is the advantage of Jamstack workflow. There is a lot more to Jamstack. You can read all about it on this specific website. But that is what Jamstack is. Now, there are quite a few solutions for static sites, how you can build out those static sites. So if you have a blog, some sort of static content, as viable options. So the first one is Gatsby. Now, Gatsby was acquired by Netlify, and it's been pretty awesome. And Netlify is another static hosting provider, which is quite popular. And so is Vercel. We'll take a look at that later. But Gatsby is, again, a really powerful option for static sites. Then we have Nuxt, which is for Vue, which is for a Vue framework, which is again a good option for static sites. Then we have obviously Next.js for React, which is my recommendation. That's why we have a rocket next to it. Then we have Jekyll for Ruby, which was really popular back in the day to convert your plain text into static sites and blogs. Again, it uses Markdown, which is what GitHub uses as well to create files. Then we have Astro for React, and this is a framework that I'm really interested, and I think it's really cool, and it's up and coming and booming, so definitely keep an eye on that. So But if you were to get started, I would just say that go for Next.js or go for Astro because both of them have rocket science next to it. Now, when you have to host these static sites, we have a few options. Again, talking about hosting, we do have something like Netlify, which allows you to build your sites really fast. Then we have Vercel, which is another popular solution which comes in the Next.js world. Vercel is a huge contributor to the world of Next.js. Then we have GitHub Pages, which is another option where you want to host your pages. It's really awesome. It works really well with Jekyll, like they showed you. But all you need to do is create a GitHub repository and then add your files there and host it. I would highly recommend this one if you just want to start a blog because GitHub would do everything for you. Also has a step-by-step instruction, which is pretty amazing. So I highly recommend GitHub Pages. Again, for hosting, I recommend all these options. That's why there's a rocket sign here. Now, before we move on to content management system, I also want to show you the Jamstack site. Jamstack site also has these site generators, which are basically Jamstack sites in general. And you can basically take a look at their licenses, templates, languages, and also GitHub stars. So Next.js is quite popular. Then is Hugo, then is Gatsby, Nux, Docusaurus, Jekyll, and so Astro is also right up there. So there are quite a few options. So you can definitely keep an eye on this specific site. Then for headless CMS, that means a CMS that does not necessarily require a server, then there are all these options as well. We won't be taking a look at that, but we will be talking about content management system right now, which will shed light on this. So then we have content management systems. Now, what exactly are content management systems? Now, content for to know content management system, we need to talk about headless CMS. Now, what is a headless CMS? A headless CMS means it's a backend content management system. It does not have any front end. So it will give you the backend. That means all your code can live there, all your blogs can live there. But it separates itself from the UI part of the application, means no front end UI, which is pretty cool in a way. So there's one option that's quite popular right now, which is Contentful. But there was one option called WordPress, which is still popular in a niche market, but was very popular back in the day. I also had a WordPress blog and I started off with that. It was pretty easy to get started before all these static site generators came along. Jekyll and Next.js and all of Gatsby and so on. But WordPress really allowed you to, create your content. It gave you a really nice GUI. So it gave you a system like this where you can manage your posts, you can manage your comments, give you a profile, and so on. So WordPress was really popular back in the day, and it still is. These are a few examples of the headless CMS today. Strappy, Ghost, Directus, WordPress, and so on. So there are quite a few headless CMS. But one really popular one that a lot of marketing companies and marketing sites use is Contentful. Because Contentful also lets marketing teams manage their content on the front end. And then you get to build React components in the back end so that you can say this is how the content will get rendered. But Contentful is also a headless CMS and is quite popular. Next, let's talk about package management. Now, we have already taken a look at NPM before. NPM is a registry and it also gives you a command line tool so you can install any of the packages. Now, remember I talked about if you want to create a library, you want to package it all up and you want to store it somewhere, then you can push it to something like NPM and anyone can then download it, and once it gains popularity, then it becomes like a standard in the industry. So you can search any packages that you want in general. But what package management means is that all your packages will be managed onto this website, and then you can basically those packages and other people can use it, which is pretty awesome. There's one more package manager that is quite popular, is called Yarn. Now, Yarn again is very similar. So again, I can just search math library here as well. And typically you would find the same library here, which is right here as well. So you could install the same library through Yarn too. But there are a few differences between how you use NPM versus Yarn. For beginners, I would highly recommend you just use NPM because Yarn has its quirks that might trip you up. So make sure you just stick to npm. Then we have package runners. You just basically execute a specific command and install the packages. So let's say we go to the Next.js documentation. Then it uses npx, which is a package runner. So it will run this specific command, but it will also install all the packages for you. And this is a command line tool, so it will ask you things like how you want to set up your project and all of that. And then based on the answers you give it, it's going to install everything for you. And that exactly is the benefit of using something like a package runner. You remember when it came to using or running a specific command, we were using npm here already. So we use npm run hello, npm run dev to start our server. So that is exactly what npm does. And there are quite a few popular libraries in npm or yarn which I would recommend. One is datefns or moment. So it's a modern date utility library. Dates can be quite complicated in JavaScript to manage with years, days, months, with leap year and so on. It can get really complicated. You don't want to code that from scratch. Someone has already figured it out for us. So we could just use format date, and then this would mean that it's going to use the internal JavaScript APIs, and then it's going to internal JavaScript functions, and then you can just execute it. Then we also have moment.js as well. I personally have used this library a lot to format dates. It will format it really easily for us, which makes our life really easy. So for example, if you want to format like this, then use this specific function, and that's it. Then we have Lodash. It's a utility library. It will give you a lot of common functions that we typically need and have to code from scratch. Lodash will give that. Another example is Ramda, which will also give you a lot of common utility functions that we need. And if you remember functional programming that we learned in the basics of JavaScript functions, right here, that Ramda and Lodash, both of them use functional programming. So there you go. So there are libraries that basically follow those principles as well. Then we have RxJS. I would ask you to stay away from it because RxJS can get quite complicated. It uses something called as observables pattern, and even though they have the best intentions, RxJS can be really complicated even for advanced developers. So stay away as beginner devs, but this is a popular option that I wanted to kind of mention. Then we have Axios. Fetch is already available to us, but there's another popular library called Axios, which gives you more capabilities on top of Fetch, which JavaScript just cannot. So, and the other library is D3. Now, D3 is an amazing visualization library. So you want to add charts, you want to add axes, different polygons, and things like that. You can easily use D3 for that. It's pretty cool. We can also try D3 online if you want. And then you can go through the documentation to see how you could use it. Now, if you're using D3 in a React project, then you could also use specific modules from D3. So all of these are really popular libraries. Now, there are a ton that I cannot even cover, but these are some of the common ones. So let's talk about the backend. Now, as we saw in this specific diagram for how websites work, browser is what handles the front end, which is the UI part of your application. But the server backend is in the server side, where backend code will have all the data. It will store all the data. It will give you all the manipulated data that we need. So that is what backend is. But as a front-end developer, what you need to know from the backend is that it gives you two types of information, two types of data. One of them is called APIs, and you want to know how backend gets powered. Even though we know that backend is a server, it's someone's computer, how does backend run? What do they do exactly? The way backend runs, the things that backend uses is something called as Node.js. Now, Node.js is a JavaScript runtime environment, and Node is run on the backend to again give us different types of data. Then there's one more thing called as Express, which is a framework for Node.js, which sits on top of Node.js. So see how we have JavaScript for browsers, and then on top of that we have React, Vue, Angular, Astro, Remix, and so on, Next, and so on. Similarly for Node, you write the backend in Node. Obviously, there are also other backend languages and frameworks as well. For a JavaScript developer, you want to know is that Node runs in the backend, and Express is the web framework that is run on top of Node, like we see here. So if you head over to the Getting Started document, you can just npm install Express from the npmjs.com directory and then start the server. So for example, all you need to do is start a port on the servers on that computer and then just run npm node app, which will run the server locally. What's important for you to know is that backend is powered by these. Now, these two, like Node.js and Express, will give you something called as an API back so that the front end can interact with it. The communication between backend and front end is via APIs. And one of them is called as a REST API. Now, REST is a protocol, but an example of a REST API is this one. Now, REST API has something called as a GET request. It will get you the data. A GET request has given you all this data. Let's go to something called as mock API. Now, mock API is a simple tool that will let you mock the data. Now, we could literally say generate 70 books, for example, or let's say 14 books and so on. When we do say that, this specific endpoint that we got is going to regenerate the number of books accordingly. But this mock API is an API endpoint. And when we say new resource, or when we ask it to generate 65, 35, 45 results, that means we're telling it that, hey, create new books inside the specific API endpoint. And that's what REST APIs give us. It allows us to create, read, update, and delete data from the backend. It's our way of talking to the backend and say, hey, give me this information. Give me the books information that you have. Create this one new book because I recently bought a new book, and so on. So that's what REST APIs are. And this is a REST API that we got back. Now, there's another way of getting information from the backend, which is called as GraphQL. Now, GraphQL has gained a lot of popularity. Now, what happens in a REST API is that we get all the data back. Now, when I say, give me the data for books, it's going to give me all the data for the books. In GraphQL, you can say that, hey, this is the book's data, and the GraphQL sits in the middle. So for example, this is a really good example here. If I say for hero, I need name, height, and mass, GraphQL is only going to give you exactly what you need. So the user doesn't have to download a lot of data from the backend, for example. So here in the books API, if I use GraphQL, then if I say I only want the avatar URL, then I only get the avatar URL. I do not get created at name and ID. And that means the user is going to download only avatar URL. It's not going to download the unnecessary information that we don't need. This means that we get a huge performance benefit thanks to GraphQL. So again, the reason why you should be aware of GraphQL and REST API is because as a front-end developer, that's exactly how you're going to interact with the backend server. Your front end is going to use something like Axios that we saw earlier, or is going to use something like fetch to then call the backend APIs. But for GraphQL, if you want to call it, you can definitely use something like fetch. But GraphQL is like, let me make it easy for you. There's also something called as Apollo Client, which is a state management library, which helps you manage state. And it also allows you to interact with your backend data using GraphQL. Other option is Hasura, which also lets you query your database, for example, and gives you all that data. So it will query your server, for example, and give you all that data. So these are two options that are popular. There are quite a few in GraphQL. We won't be diving into it. But what you need to know is that backend does have a database which stores all the information for the user, and you can interact with it via APIs using GraphQL or REST API. Let's talk about version control systems. Now, remember we talked about Git. When we went to GitHub, we can have all our website code in here on GitHub. Now, this is my website code. If we go to the Git site, you can read all about what you can do with Git and what you cannot. So there's a bunch of reference and examples here. But a few things that we can do is all version control, branching, merging, and so on. Now, these names can sound really scary, but let me tell you what Git does. Let's say you're working in a team And you want to make sure that you all are not just storing your code in your computer. Because if you just keep the code in your computer, how will your teammate access that code? You need a central place where all the code can go. And that is the benefit of using something like GitHub. You push the code here, and then using a command like git clone, we can then clone this repo. So for example, if I copy this command, I can head over to my terminal and just go back a directory and then literally git clone this specific URL. So if let's say this is the project that you and I in a team are using, then we can just push it to a repo inside of GitHub and copy it in our local computers. That's what clone does. Git allow us to do that. But in order for us to push that code, Git uses something called as branches, which is some you can think of branches as for creating a folder and saying, "Hey, this is my folder that you can start reviewing." This allows us for tight collaboration. So let's say I'm writing some code, my teammates can review it, and that is known as pull request as well. So if I go to pull request tab, I can add some code, push it, and then say the folder that I just created. So for example, let's say if it's block ps as a folder, then this is the pull request I want to create, and these are all the changes that I have made. Now this is just one example. Now there are also options to merge your data. So let's say your teammate pushes a function called as addition, and you also had to write a function called as addition. Then obviously there will be a conflict, right? Because you are basically adding the same function in the same spot. In that case, you can decide whose function is better, or update the function, or delete one function, and so on. For that, you would use something called as merging or rebasing. And obviously, there are two platforms that use Git. One is GitHub, and the other one is GitLab. The Git is evolved, and it came way later. Back in the day, there was something called as SVN, and something called as Tortoise SVN. And what this does is that it was a client where I could just transfer files from one computer to the other, and I can manage all those files. Now this is quite outdated. No one uses this anymore thanks to Git, but this is something that everyone used back in the day. So I'm going to write this as Tortoise SVN. I almost forgot about this one. But back in the day, that's how we transferred files between computers. And whenever someone updated a file, you had to make sure you pull all the changes. Otherwise, there will be a conflict and your changes will be outdated. So Tortoise SVN was what was used back in the day to basically make sure all your file changes were in sync with each other. So that's what Tortoise SVN does. So that's the overview of version control. The reason why it's called version control, we are controlling the different versions of code we are adding between our computers and making sure all of them make sense. What exactly is a cloud? A cloud is a collection of servers with a lot of different capabilities, and we can interact with those different servers. So there are quite a few cloud options that we have available. Google has its cloud platform. DigitalOcean has its cloud platform. Azure, which is from Microsoft, IBM, Heroku, and so on. But if I were to suggest one, I would use Google Cloud Platform. Now, all of them have different services that you can use. So, for example, you can just create a database on Google's cloud. It's going to pick a server for you. It's going to give you a computer on their cloud, which is a collection of servers. It'll just give it to you and say, like, hey, this is your server. And you can then go and create a database. This means that it's going to literally go in some computer somewhere in the world and create a database that your data will be stored in that. So that's what the advantage of cloud is. Then you can interact with the database. There are different services for the database and so on. So all of these are different providers for those that. Next, and the last topic is soft skills. Now, as a front-end developer, when you start working in a team or when you're interviewing, I would say that your hard skills, that is your programming knowledge, your knowledge about JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, everything that we covered today, I would say 80% of the way it will get you there. But in order for you to truly get a job and then survive in a team and make sure you are a really good teammate, you definitely need these soft skills, and do not skip these soft skills, otherwise you are not going to get a job. I have talked to many developers that I have coached or mentored who say that it's because of their soft skills they're not getting a job because they don't know how to communicate, they don't understand the different team dynamics, and so on. So do not underestimate the soft skills. There are a few that I would recommend so that you make sure that you become a successful front-end developer, and a top tier one. First one is time management. Time management means that you know exactly how to manage your time. You are not spending days on a task. You know when to ask for help, and you are on time wherever you go. You're never late for meetings, and overall you respect everyone else's time. If you are late for a meeting, you let the people know why and apologize for being late. So having a hold on time management is extremely important as you start working in a team. No one will like you if you spend days working on something that's going to waste a lot of time and block others as well. So definitely make sure you have good time management capabilities. The next one is teamwork. Be a good team player. It's not your code that you're working on. It's your team's code. Your team and you together collaboratively own the team code. So make sure you're working in collaboration. You are getting when you get feedback, you are responding to that feedback well. You know exactly what to do during code reviews. And code review is a process where your code gets reviewed by other peers. So make sure that you are showing teamwork. If someone needs help, help them. Because at the end of the day, if your team is successful, so will you. Then problem solving capabilities. It doesn't matter which technology. Today is JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. Tomorrow it's something completely different. Now there's AI that's taking over the world. If you have good problem solving capabilities and know exactly what's right for the user, for the application that you're building, then you are halfway there. Truly, what matters is you coding that in that specific language. But if you know how to solve a problem, then it's going to be a lot easier for you, which is why it's important. Efficient communication. Make sure you are verbose in your communication. You are putting an extra effort to explain things, document things, explain your thoughts clearly because that's really important. In an interview, if you know how to communicate well, the chances of getting a job are quite high because not everyone knows proper communication skills. So make sure you are an efficient communicator. And lastly, growth mindset versus fixed mindset. A growth mindset is a mindset where you basically consider sort of hurdles in your journey with a growth mindset. That these are not just problems that you get stuck upon all the time. This is something you're using that to learn. I have a blog post on this specific topic, which is part of my newsletter. If you think of every experience as a growth opportunity, as a learning opportunity, then you create a positive work environment. Now, as a developer, you will be stuck a lot. You will face a lot of problems. It's your problem solving skills. Also, the mindset that you approach the problem with is extremely important. So, growth mindset will allow you to do that. You can improve your skills when you work hard, accept challenges, and are open to feedback from everyone. But versus a fixed mindset is someone who gets stuck on a problem and are like, damn, I cannot grow at all. This is a very difficult problem to solve. And that's not exactly what you want. So make sure that you approach and know the differences between growth mindset and fixed mindset and truly approach the front-end development journey with a growth mindset. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you really like this video, I would love to hear from you. What type of roadmap I should create next? Please comment below and let me know. As next steps after this roadmap, I would recommend you to watch this specific video which talks about the software engineering practices that you need to master to truly become a successful front-end developer. Or this video will give you a Tailwind crash course so you can take your front-end development journey further. So I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.